Hey everybody, welcome to the Mainstream Indie Music channel. We talk about all things alternative and indie music, and this is a special episode. This is a part of our What If series, and it's pretty much exactly how it sounds. You know, the interesting thing about alternative and indie music that's different than probably a lot, if almost all genres of music, is a lot of times there are a lot of stories left unanswered or wondered about with indie music, because whether it's by choice or whether it's just by circumstances, a lot of the bands veer off in these crazy kind of different directions. And with all music, you wonder, well, what if this happened or that happened? Would things have played out differently? How things would play out differently? And this week's episode is no different. However, I do want to clarify some things before I begin this week's episode. I want to change kind of the direction of these videos because I don't want things to get super far-fetched with some of these videos. And I haven't gotten any negative feedback at all with them. But I kind of just want them to make a little bit more sense, or what I want to start to do is provide some kind of background to the idea that I'm presenting first. Kind of lay things out first before I kind of go into the depths and kind of the ideas that I have for the rest of the video. So to begin with this week's episode, we are talking about the Postal Service. Now, before we kind of go into the video, let's kind of lay the history of this band as it played out where we are right now. The Postal Service is a band that lead man and brains behind Death Cab for Cutie, Ben Gibbard, started in 2003. It was a completely different sound than what a lot of bands, if not almost every single band, had ever seen up to that point. And they have only released one major album called, as you can see on screen, Give Up. It was a huge cultural movement and shift in the indie world at the time. And I remember it was kind of divisive. Because some people loved the direction that Ben Gibbard was trying with this album, and some people absolutely did not like it because it wasn't Death Cab. And on top of it, it wasn't like Ben had released an album where it at least was more alternative rock, so you could kind of tie it into Death Cab for Cutie. It was completely different. It was an alternative, it was an electronic album. Similar to another band, which we're going to talk about a little later in the video. And that was it. They released that album. They had several huge hits off of it, especially Such Great Heights. That's probably, if you think early 2000s indie music, that's probably one of the songs that you might come to your head. You could probably hear those opening electric notes right now as I describe it. So that's who the band was. If you don't really remember, or if you don't know, that's kind of laying out the history, and that's all that they've done. Now, what's interesting is last year, while on tour, Ben decided to do both bands in a limited series run, where he would perform first as the Postal Service, and then he would start to perform Death Cab set, all in one major concert. Now, they've also done several reunion tours as well, especially after the 10-year anniversary mark. So they have done that in the past. Now, like I said, let's lay out some kind of ground rules, or give you some context as to what ideas I'm going to provide for this What If series if the Postal Service kept going. Number one is pretty much the idea of how big Ben Gibbard and Death Cab for Cutie was in the early 2000s. I always liken this illustration on this channel to like the Mount Rushmore of indie music. Who would be on it? I mean, Ben Gibbard would have to be on it. In the early 2000s, he was everywhere. Death Cab was everywhere at the time. This was when they were at their peak popularity and their peak artistic form, I guess you could even say. They were just absolutely massive. You think of the huge hits of Narrow Stairs, Transatlanticism, and Plans. It was just absolutely wild how big they were at the time. And so before Codes and Keys, they really could just do no wrong, especially him. Now, the second thing that I want to mention to this video is what happened to electronic music, and music in general in the late 2000s and 2010s. There was a huge shift blending electronic music into the mainstream. And it wasn't just one genre of music that did this. It almost became everywhere. It became the staple for a lot of those bands back then. And one band that took advantage of that got a huge hit out, was the band called Owl City. Now, of course, there are a lot of similarities between the sound of the Postal Service and Owl City. In fact, the lead singer and kind of brains of Owl City, credits the Postal Service to a lot of his work as well. And he kind of knows that, his music is kind of very similar to the sound that the Postal Service gave. But of course, Owl City's not alone. There was other electronic bands, especially in the late 2000s, early 2010s as well, that replicated or very closely replicated the sound of the Postal Service. And so that leads to the question, what if the Postal Service never had stopped as a group, and what if they kept going and making albums? So with both those things combined, both those ideas combined, of how big Death Cab was and how big Owl City and other electronic sounding groups were in the 2000s, that leads to this point. Now, while there was a lot of backlash at the time, like I said, well, not a lot, but some backlash to the new sound that Ben Gibbard was experimenting with, some people not quite being ready for that. Like I mentioned in the beginning, with the huge shift overall in mainstream music to adding electronic beats, soundscapes in the background, and pretty much how it's been fully integrated, especially into the indie alternative crowds and bands here today, I think that Postal Service would be absolutely huge. And I think Ben Gibbard himself would be one of the biggest musicians to this day, like an innovator in his field. Now, the reasons why they kind of stop has been explored. It's been explained by Ben himself, saying like it was kind of a one-time thing. It was kind of just wanting to experiment and then get right back into Death Cab. Of course, we know around this time too, his personal life got very, very crazy. That is a little bit into it. But like I said, main point, I think they would be big. One of the biggest bands of the 2010s, and Ben Gibbard himself would be absolutely huge in the music scene, even bigger than he is today.